James Carver had been told the Thrane ceremonial chamber would be impressive. The briefing materials, hastily assembled during his two-day crash course in interstellar diplomacy, described it as architecturally significant and designed to convey the Ascendancy's power and historical authority. They'd understated it significantly. The chamber was vast enough that James's footsteps echoed despite the tapestries and carved panels that covered the walls. Those walls told the history of the Thrane Ascendancy in relief sculptures that depicted conquests, treaties, subjugation of species that had challenged Thrane's supremacy and lost. The ceiling was lost in shadows despite lighting that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. And at the far end, elevated on a dais that required anyone approaching to literally look upward, Queen Shar'veth Tel Navros, absolute ruler of the Thrane Ascendancy, commander of the fleets that had burned human colonies, the face of an enemy James had seen only in propaganda footage. She was exactly as imposing as the briefing suggested. Thrane physiology was built for combat, taller than human average, muscular in ways that suggested predatory efficiency, with elongated ears that could track threats through minute sound variations, and eyes that processed tactical information with disturbing speed. She wore ceremonial armor that managed to be both artistic and functional, every element designed to communicate power that had endured for millennia. The chamber was filled with Thrane nobility, military commanders, advisors who'd spent their lives studying the intricacies of negotiation and conflict. They watched James with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. One human, a nobody, standing in the most sacred diplomatic space the Thrane possessed, about to speak words that would either end a war or condemn billions more to die in it. James's hands were shaking. He gripped his worn datapad tighter, trying to project confidence he absolutely didn't feel. Behind him, in the observation gallery, the human delegation waited. He could feel their tension, their awareness that he was about to either justify the inexplicable decision to send him or prove catastrophically that someone had made a terrible mistake. Queen Shar'veth stared at him with an intensity that made every instinct James possessed scream at him to look away, to submit, to acknowledge her authority and hope that deference would buy mercy. The chamber fell absolutely silent. Protocol dictated that the Queen speak first in her own ceremonial space. Everyone knew this. It had been emphasized in every briefing James received. The human delegation was waiting for Shar'veth to open the talks with formal declaration of terms, to establish the framework within which negotiations would occur. But James knew something they didn't know, something he'd learned not from diplomatic training, but from 15 years building infrastructure on colony worlds. Sometimes the person with formal authority isn't the person who needs to speak first. Sometimes the person with the problem is the one who should start the conversation. James stepped forward, not aggressive, just closing some of the physical distance the chamber's design imposed between petitioner and throne. He could hear startled reactions behind him from the human delegation, could see Thrane advisors tensing as he violated expected protocol. Queen Shar'veth's expression shifted fractionally, surprise, maybe, or calculation about whether this breach of etiquette warranted immediate termination of the talks. "Your Majesty," James said clearly, his voice carrying in the chamber's perfect acoustics. "I'm James Carver. I'm not a diplomat, not a general, not anyone important in the human political structure. I build water treatment plants and design infrastructure for frontier colonies. 3 months ago, I was installing filtration systems on New Perth. Today, I'm standing in your ceremonial chamber because someone decided an engineer was the right person to help end this war." He paused, feeling the weight of every eye in the chamber focused on him. "I'm going to tell you why I think they sent me, and then I'm going to tell you the truth about what humanity can and can't accept in these negotiations. Not the diplomatic version, just the truth. Because we're both exhausted, both losing people we can't afford to lose, and both desperately need this to work even if neither of us wants to admit it. The chamber remained silent. Queen Shar'veth hadn't moved, hadn't indicated whether James should continue or whether he'd already destroyed humanity's last chance at peace. But she hadn't stopped him either. "I think they sent me," James continued, "because diplomats are trained to negotiate, and this isn't a negotiation anymore. This is two species who have pushed each other to the breaking point, trying to figure out if there's any way to step back before we destroy each other completely. And maybe what we need isn't someone who knows how to make deals. Maybe we need someone who knows how to build things, how to look at broken systems and figure out how to make them work again." James pulled up data on his datapad, not the carefully prepared presentation the diplomatic corps had provided, but raw numbers he'd compiled himself during the journey to the Thrane homeworld. "New Perth colony where I've been working. Population approximately 80,000 before the war started. Current population 23,000. The rest evacuated, killed in raids, or conscripted into military service that took them off-world." He looked up from the datapad. "The water treatment facility I spent 3 years building, destroyed in orbital bombardment 9 months ago. People I worked with, trained, knew by name. 60% casualties." He looked directly at Queen Shar'veth. "I'm not telling you this to claim human suffering is unique or special. I'm telling you because these are the numbers I know personally. These are the faces I remember. And I know that your people have their own versions of these numbers. Your own colonies damaged, your own infrastructure destroyed, your own populations depleted by 7 years of war that neither side is actually winning. You presume to understand Thrane losses." One of the advisors spoke sharply, clearly offended by James's directness. "No," James replied honestly. "I presume to understand that losing people you're responsible for hurts regardless of species. That watching infrastructure you built get destroyed is frustrating whether you're human or Thrane. That 7 years of war means 7 years of resources going to weapons instead of development, casualties instead of growth, fear instead of progress." He turned back to Shar'veth. "The diplomatic corps prepared elaborate proposals about territorial divisions and resource allocations and trade agreements. I read them during the journey here. They're probably very sophisticated, full of carefully balanced compromises and face-saving language for both sides." James paused. "But I think they're missing the fundamental question we need to answer before any of those details matter." "And what question is that?" Queen Shar'veth spoke for the first time, her voice carrying harmonics that James's translator rendered with formal authority that made the air feel heavier. "Can we acknowledge that this war isn't serving either of our species anymore? That whatever grievances started it, whatever territorial disputes or resource conflicts or political calculations drove us to violence 7 years ago, they're less important now than the simple fact that continuing to fight is destroying both of us." James took a breath, committed now to the approach that would either work or end everything. "I'm an engineer, Your Majesty. I solve problems by understanding systems and figuring out how to fix what's broken. The system here is broken. Humanity and the Thrane Ascendancy are locked in conflict that's consuming resources both species need for survival. The war might have made sense once. Maybe there were good reasons on both sides. But those reasons matter less than the reality we're facing now. We're both losing, not to each other, to the war itself." "You suggest the Thrane Ascendancy is losing." Another advisor, voice sharp with insult. "I suggest we're both losing," James corrected, meeting the advisor's gaze before returning his attention to the Queen. "Humanity is losing. The Thrane are losing. We're losing people, resources, infrastructure, future potential. Every ship we build for war is a ship we can't use for exploration or trade. Every soldier who dies is someone who won't build cities or advance science or create art. Every colony destroyed is generations of development erased." He pulled up more data, casualty projections, resource depletion curves, economic analyses showing both species' declining capacity to sustain prolonged conflict. So yes, we're both losing, and we'll keep losing until one of us is destroyed completely, or until we acknowledge that there might be more value in figuring out how to coexist than in fighting, until there's nothing left worth fighting for. The chamber erupted in voices, Thrane advisors objecting to James's characterization, human observers in the gallery trying to signal him to moderate his approach, military commanders on both sides clearly uncomfortable with this level of directness. Queen Shar'veth raised one hand, and the chamber fell silent again instantly. "You speak with unusual directness for a human diplomat," she said. "I'm not a diplomat, Your Majesty. I'm an engineer who was sent here because someone thought the truth might work better than diplomacy." James didn't back down from her gaze. Diplomats are trained to find mutually acceptable compromises and phrase everything in ways that preserve everyone's dignity. "I'm trained to fix broken systems. And this system, 7 years of war destroying both our species, is broken. And you believe you can fix it." There was something in her tone that James couldn't quite identify. Skepticism, maybe, or genuine curiosity, or calculation about whether this approach offered something traditional diplomacy hadn't. "Not alone," James admitted. "But I think I can help us see it clearly enough to fix it together. Because right now, we're both pretending the war is still winnable if we just commit enough resources, or develop the right strategy, or hold out long enough for the other side to break. But that's not true, and I think everyone in this chamber knows it." Queen Shar'veth descended from the dais. The movement was so unexpected that several of her advisors actually stepped forward as if to protect her, then froze as she waved them back. She crossed the space between the throne and where James stood, eliminating the physical hierarchy the chamber's design enforced. Up close, she was even more imposing, taller than James by a significant margin, her ceremonial armor showing scars from actual combat, her eyes carrying an intelligence that suggested she was processing his words at multiple levels simultaneously. "You are either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, James Carver." "Probably both, Your Majesty. I'm an engineer in a diplomatic situation. That's either brilliant improvisation or catastrophic mistake, and I won't know which until we see how this ends." Something that might have been amusement flickered across her expression. "You speak as though you have nothing to lose." "I don't really. I'm not a career diplomat who'll be blamed if these talks fail. I'm just someone who builds things, trying to figure out if there's a way to build peace instead of continuing to destroy each other." James met her gaze directly. "But you have everything to lose. You're the queen. Your decisions affect billions of Thrane lives. The weight of this war, the casualties, the resource depletion, that's on your shoulders. Same way it's on the shoulders of humanity's leadership. You presume to understand the burdens of rulership. I presume to understand that leaders who care about their people recognize when continuing a policy costs more than changing it." James gestured at the chamber, at the assembled Thrane nobility and military commanders. "And from everything I've read about your rule, everything I've observed in how you've conducted this war, you care about the Thrane people. You wouldn't be here if you didn't." Flattery, engineer. Observation based on available data, Your Majesty. Leaders who don't care about their people don't agree to peace talks. They fight until their civilization collapses or they're removed from power. You're here. That tells me you're looking for a solution." Queen Shar'veth was silent for a long moment, studying him with an intensity that made James acutely aware of how much power she held in this moment. One word and the talks ended. One gesture and he was removed from the chamber, possibly from existence. But when she spoke, her voice carried something James hadn't expected: vulnerability. "I am tired of war, James Carver. I am tired of casualty reports and destroyed colonies and resources consumed by endless conflict. I am tired of telling Thrane families that their children died for territorial disputes that matter less with each passing year. I am tired of knowing that every decision I make, as queen, must account for military expenditure that depletes our civilization's capacity for growth. She gestured at her assembled advisors and commanders, her voice dropping slightly so only James and those immediately nearby could hear clearly. But I cannot show that exhaustion to my people, cannot acknowledge that the war might have been a mistake or that continuing it serves only pride and momentum rather than strategic purpose, cannot appear weak before those who would use any sign of uncertainty to challenge my authority or push for more aggressive military action. Then don't appear weak, James suggested. Appear wise. Appear strong enough to choose peace over endless conflict. Appear confident enough to acknowledge that ending this war isn't surrender, it's strategic victory through alternative means. Explain. The Thrane Ascendancy is strong enough militarily that humanity can't defeat you through conventional force. Our fleets are roughly matched. Our defensive capabilities prevent decisive victories. Our technological parity means neither side can gain overwhelming advantage. James pulled up military analysis on his datapad. Humanity is resilient enough that you can't defeat us. We rebuild faster than you can destroy. We adapt to your tactics. We refuse to surrender even when logical strategic analysis says we should. He looked at her directly. Those aren't signs of weakness on either side. They're signs that both species are formidable. A weak leader continues fighting a war they can't win, throwing resources into a conflict that's destroying their civilization. A strong leader recognizes when conflict has reached strategic stalemate and finds a different solution that preserves their people's future. James gestured between them. You and I standing here talking instead of shooting at each other. That's not weakness, Your Majesty. That's both species being smart enough to try something other than mutual destruction. That's leadership that values survival and growth over pride and momentum. Queen Shar'veth considered this. Then she turned to address the full chamber, her voice carrying formal authority again. This human speaks with unusual clarity about our situation. He acknowledges realities that trained diplomats obscure with careful language and face-saving protocols. I propose we continue these talks with the understanding that both species seek peace not from weakness, but from strategic wisdom that recognizes continued conflict serves neither the Thrane Ascendancy nor humanity. She looked back at James. Tell me, engineer, if you were designing peace the way you design water treatment facilities, what would it look like? Functional, James replied immediately. Not perfect, not ideal for either side, but working. Sustainable, built on recognition that both species need the system to function more than they need to prove they're right or superior or deserving of better terms. He pulled up schematics on his datapad, actual engineering designs from his infrastructure work, using them as visual metaphor. Water treatment design starts with understanding what you need the system to accomplish. Clean water for the population, minimal resource expenditure, sustainable operation over time. Then you build toward those goals, compromising on aesthetic preferences or ideal configurations in favor of what actually works. And for peace between our species, what are the necessary goals? Both species survive and develop without constant military threat. Resources currently spent on war get redirected to growth and advancement. Future conflicts, because there will be future conflicts, get resolved through negotiation rather than violence. Trade and cultural exchange become possible, even if they're not immediately comfortable for either side. James met her gaze. We're not going to love each other immediately, probably won't for generations. 7 years of war created wounds that won't heal quickly. But we can build a system where we don't need to love each other to coexist productively, where both species benefit from peace more than either benefits from continued war. Queen Shar'veth extended her hand, a gesture that James's cultural briefings identified as Thrane acknowledgement of equal standing. Then let us build this functional peace, engineer. You and I together, while our diplomats work on the details they're trained to manage. James took her hand, aware that he was probably making history or catastrophic mistake, and still uncertain which. Let's build something that works, Your Majesty, not something perfect, just something both our species can live with. Over the following weeks, the formal negotiations proceeded in parallel with something unprecedented. A human engineer and a Thrane queen working together on the fundamental framework that would support the detailed agreements. They met daily in smaller chambers, without the full diplomatic corps, often with just a handful of advisors who could translate technical concepts and political realities between James's practical approach and Shar'veth's strategic thinking. Humanity wants security guarantees for our frontier colonies, James explained during one session, pulling up maps showing the contested border regions. But we know you need those same regions for resource access and strategic positioning. Traditional diplomatic approach would be to fight over specific boundaries until someone gives up enough territory to make the other side accept the deal. And your engineering approach, Shar'veth asked, shared development zones. Neither species gets exclusive control. Both species get access to resources. Both commit to defending the regions against external threats. It's not ideal for either side. You don't get exclusive Thrane territory. We don't get exclusive human territory. But it works. Both species benefit. Both have incentive to maintain the agreement. My military commanders will resist shared zones. They want clearly defined territories they can defend without coordination with human forces. And our military will resist too. But what they want is less important than what both species need, which is an end to the resource drain of constant border conflicts. James pulled up economic projections. Shared zones cost less to maintain than militarized borders. Resources saved can go to development both species need. The arrangement isn't perfect, but it's functional and sustainable. Shar'veth studied the projections, ran her own calculations. This could work, if both species commit to enforcing the agreements rather than exploiting ambiguities. That's where the cultural exchange programs come in. Hard to exploit people you're trading with, studying with, building relationships with. Not impossible, but harder than maintaining total separation. They built the peace framework piece by piece. Territorial arrangements that neither side loved, but both could accept. Trade agreements that benefited both species. Cultural exchange programs that would slowly reduce the mutual hostility 7 years of war had created. And most importantly, dispute resolution mechanisms that provided alternatives to violence when future conflicts arose. 3 months after James had walked into the Thrane ceremonial chamber expecting to fail catastrophically, the Treaty of Shared Futures was ready for formal signing. The ceremony was held in the same chamber where the talks had begun, but the atmosphere was completely different. Representatives from both species filled the space, not as enemies watching each other warily, but as participants in something neither side had quite believed was possible. Queen Shar'veth addressed the assembled observers first. This piece was built by unlikely architects, a human engineer and a Thrane queen, both recognizing that continuing to fight served neither species' interests. We did not achieve victory in traditional sense. The Thrane Ascendancy did not conquer humanity. Humanity did not defeat the Ascendancy. But we achieved something more valuable, survival with dignity and potential for future growth. She looked at James, who stood beside her as co-architect of the peace framework. The human who began these talks by speaking truth instead of diplomacy taught me that strength includes knowing when to choose peace over conquest. That wisdom includes acknowledging when war costs more than it can ever gain. That leadership means building solutions rather than just winning battles. James added his own perspective to the ceremony. 7 years of war taught both species that were strong enough to survive each other's worst efforts. That's valuable knowledge. We learned we can't be easily defeated, can't be forced to surrender, can't be eliminated from the galaxy through military force alone. He gestured at the assembled representatives from both species. But the peace we've built together teaches something more important. We're wise enough to choose coexistence over mutual destruction. That's not weakness. That's both species being smart enough to build a future instead of just fighting over the past. That's leadership, human and Thrane, recognizing that survival matters more than pride. The treaty was signed. Both species committed to peace, not because they'd been defeated, but because they'd been smart enough to recognize that continuing to fight destroyed the future both needed. 6 months later, James returned to New Perth Colony to help rebuild the water treatment facility he designed before the war. Queen Shar'veth sent a Thrane engineering team to assist, partially as gesture of goodwill, partially because shared development projects were part of the treaty framework, but mostly because she'd learned from an engineer that building things together was more valuable than fighting over who got to control them. James worked alongside Thrane engineers who'd been enemies a year ago, building infrastructure that would serve both species colonies in the region. It was awkward sometimes, difficult often, but it worked. Functional, sustainable. Not perfect, just like the peace. Sometimes the most important moment in a war isn't a decisive battle,